The moment those blue lights flash in your rearview mirror, everything changes. Your hands tighten on the steering wheel, your mind starts racing. Was I speeding? Did I miss a sign? Is my registration up to date? You check your mirrors again, just to be sure it's really you they're pulling over. It is. You slowly drift to the shoulder, heart pounding a little harder than you'd like to admit. And then comes the part most people don't think about until it's happening in real time: the conversation. Have you ever been pulled over and later realized you might have said something you shouldn't have? Tell me honestly, what did the officer ask you, and how did you respond? Drop your experience in the comments, because what you said in that moment matters more than you probably think, and there's something coming up later in this explanation that might completely change how you handle your next traffic stop. Now here's the uncomfortable truth most drivers don't want to hear. Traffic stops are not just about traffic violations, they are investigative opportunities. Every question, every pause, every glance inside your vehicle, it's all part of a process. Officers are trained to observe, assess, and build a picture of what's going on, often within seconds. And the biggest mistake drivers make? They assume the questions are casual. They're not. Let's talk about 3 of the most deceptively simple questions officers ask. Questions that sound harmless, even polite, but can quietly lead you into legal trouble if you're not careful. The first one usually comes almost immediately after the officer walks up to your window. Do you know why I pulled you over? It sounds like a normal question, maybe even a fair one, but this is where things already start to get complicated. Most people instinctively try to be cooperative. They might say something like, "Yeah, I think I was going a little fast," or "Maybe I didn't come to a full stop." What they don't realize is they've just done the officer's job for them. In many situations, the officer already has a reason for the stop, but what they're really doing here is testing you. They want to see if you'll admit to something, because once you say it out loud, it becomes evidence. Think about how that plays out later. That simple statement, "I was probably speeding a bit," can show up in a report. It can be used to support a citation. It can even affect how a case is argued in court. Now imagine a slightly different scenario. You say, "I'm not sure, officer." That response does something interesting. It doesn't escalate the situation. It doesn't accuse the officer of anything. But it also doesn't hand over an admission. And that matters. What a lot of drivers don't understand is that silence, or careful wording, is not the same as being uncooperative. There's a difference between refusing to comply and choosing your words carefully. But here's where things get more subtle. Officers are not just listening to what you say, they're watching how you say it. Your tone, your eye contact, your hand movements, whether you seem nervous, overly talkative, or strangely quiet. And nervousness alone doesn't mean guilt, but it can raise suspicion if it's combined with other factors. So when that first question comes, the real test isn't just your answer, it's how you handle the pressure of being put on the spot. Now let's move to the second question. This is the one that can actually get you arrested if things go the wrong way. Have you had anything to drink tonight? This question seems straightforward, almost routine, especially if it's nighttime. But this is where drivers often walk straight into serious trouble. Let's say you had one drink, maybe hours ago. You feel completely fine. You're not impaired. You're thinking, "I'll just be honest." So you say, "Yeah, I had a beer earlier." From your perspective, that's harmless. From the officer's perspective, the situation just changed. Now there is an admission of alcohol consumption. That alone doesn't prove impairment, but it opens the door to further investigation. Now you might be asked to step out of the vehicle. Now come the field sobriety tests. Now the officer is watching even more closely: your balance, your speech, your coordination. And here's the part most people don't realize. Field sobriety tests are not pass or fail in the way people think. They are subjective. They are based on the officer's observations. And even small, normal human movements, like swaying slightly or missing a heel-to-toe step, can be interpreted as clues of impairment. So that one honest answer has now escalated the encounter. And if the officer believes there is probable cause, you could be arrested for DUI, even if you genuinely felt fine when you were driving. Now let's flip the scenario. You're asked, "Have you had anything to drink tonight?" You pause for a second, not too long, just enough to stay composed. And you say, "I'd prefer not to answer any questions." That response might feel uncomfortable. It might even feel awkward, but it is legally significant. You're not lying. You're not admitting anything. You're simply exercising your right to remain silent. And yes, officers might not like that response. Some might repeat the question. Some might change their tone slightly. Some might try to make you feel like you're being difficult. That's part of the pressure. Because here's what's happening from the officer's point of view. They are trying to gather information quickly. They are looking for indicators, anything that helps them decide whether to escalate the stop. When you answer freely, you're feeding that process. When you don't, they have to rely more on what they can observe directly. And that shifts the dynamic. Now here's something most people misunderstand. Choosing not to answer questions does not give you a free pass. If there are visible signs of impairment, like slurred speech, the smell of alcohol, or erratic driving, you can still be investigated and possibly arrested. But without your own words adding to the situation, the case becomes less straightforward. And that's a critical difference. Now let's talk about the third question, because this one often catches people off guard in a completely different way. Where are you coming from? Or, where are you headed? At first glance, this doesn't even feel like a legal question. It feels like small talk. But it's not. This is what's known as a fishing question. The officer is trying to establish a narrative. They want to see if your story makes sense. They want to see if it changes. Let's say you say, "I'm coming from a friend's house." A few minutes later, another officer arrives and asks you the same question in a slightly different way. "Where were you before this?" Now you say, "I was at a bar with some friends." That inconsistency might seem minor to you, but to the officer it's a red flag. Why did the story change? Now suspicion increases. Now the tone of the interaction might shift. And this is how small, harmless answers can start to build into something more serious. It's not always about what you did. Sometimes it's about how your answers are perceived. And perception plays a huge role in roadside interactions. Officers are trained to notice inconsistencies, hesitation, and changes in behavior. They're trained to ask the same question in different ways to see if the answer stays consistent. So when you're answering casually, thinking it's just conversation, they might be analyzing every word. Now let's step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Most drivers think the goal during a traffic stop is to talk their way out of it. Be polite, be friendly, explain everything. And yes, politeness matters, respect matters, tone matters. But over-explaining, that's where problems start. Because the more you talk, the more opportunities there are for something to be misunderstood, misremembered, or used against you later. And here's something that doesn't get said often enough. You don't have to prove your innocence on the side of the road. That's not the place for it. The roadside is not a courtroom. It's not a negotiation table. It's an environment where decisions are made quickly, often based on limited information. Your job in that moment is not to win an argument. It's to get through the interaction safely and without making the situation worse. Now let's walk through a realistic scenario to tie all of this together. You're driving home late, maybe around 11:30 p.m. The roads are mostly empty. Suddenly, those blue lights appear. You pull over. The officer approaches slowly, shining a flashlight inside your car. Not aggressively, just methodically. "Good evening. Do you know why I pulled you over?" You feel that pressure, that urge to respond quickly. This is the first fork in the road. Do you admit something, or do you keep it neutral? Then comes the next question. Have you had anything to drink tonight? Now your mind starts racing again. If you say yes, what happens next? If you say no, are you lying? If you stay silent, will that make things worse? And then, almost casually, where are you coming from? At this point, it can feel like a normal conversation, but it's not. Every answer is shaping how the officer sees the situation. And here's where many drivers make a critical mistake. They start talking more than necessary. They try to explain their entire evening. They add details that weren't asked for. And in doing so, they unintentionally create inconsistencies or raise new questions. Now the officer asks you to step out of the vehicle. Your heart rate increases again. You're thinking, this is getting serious. And it might be. But it might also just be part of the officer's process. The key thing to understand is that once the interaction reaches this stage, your earlier answers have already influenced what's happening. That's why those initial questions matter so much. They set the tone. They shape the direction. They can either keep the situation simple or make it more complicated. Now there's another layer to all of this that most people overlook. Timing. How quickly you respond, how long you pause, whether you interrupt or wait. These small details can change how your behavior is interpreted. A rushed answer can sound defensive. A delayed answer can sound suspicious. A calm, measured response tends to be perceived as more controlled. And that's something you can actually manage. You can't control what the officer is thinking, but you can control how you present yourself. And that includes knowing when not to answer. Now, some people hear this and think, so I should just refuse to answer everything? That's not the point. There's a balance. You are required to provide certain information, like your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance when asked. But beyond that, many questions fall into a different category. And understanding that distinction can make a real difference. Because once you start answering investigative questions freely, you're participating in building the case, whether you realize it or not. And that's where people get caught off guard. They don't feel like they're doing anything wrong. They're just talking. But in that environment, talking has consequences. Now think back to that question I asked you at the beginning. What did the officer ask you the last time you were pulled over? And more importantly, how did you respond? Because chances are, in that moment, you were making decisions under pressure without fully understanding how those answers could be used. And that's exactly why these three questions matter so much. They seem simple, they sound normal, but they're not. They're strategic. And once you start recognizing them for what they are, you start to see traffic stops very differently. Not as casual conversations, but as structured interactions where every word carries weight. And the next time those blue lights appear behind you, that awareness might be the one thing that keeps a simple stop from turning into something much more serious.